Roman auxiliary troops were soldiers in the ancient Roman Imperial army. Their role was to support the Roman legions in conquering new territory, defending the empire's borders, and suppressing revolt. Like the legionaries, auxiliaries were professional soldiers who served for 25 years in the Roman army. They were primarily recruited from the empire's non-citizen provincial population. Service in Rome's auxiliary cohorts was one of the primary means of social mobility for non-Romans in the empire, because after 25 years, they too could possibly become Roman citizens. Part 1. The historical background. How and why did Rome establish the Auxilia? When Rome was a small city-state during its period as a kingdom and in the early years of its republic, a militia of citizen soldiers was enough to defend its territory and to defeat outside threats. But as Rome's territory expanded to control most of the Italian peninsula, it needed more manpower. This first came from other Italian city-states and tribes. Initially, they fought in their own fighting styles and were sometimes quite unreliable as allies. However, over time, these other Italian peoples were gradually Romanized, from their culture to the way they fought. An effective incentive the Romans used was to grant citizenship to its reliable allies in the peninsula. Roman citizenship was highly desirable because it came with significant tax, legal, and voting rights. As Rome expanded outside the Italian peninsula, it fought formidable foes like Carthage and Macedon. Consequently, its manpower needs constantly increased. To supplement its legions, Rome hired, recruited, or allied with non-Romans from within and around its territory. Many of these had specialized skills, like slingers from the Balearic Islands, archers from Crete, or cavalrymen from Numidia and Gaul. After the Marian reforms of 107 BC, Roman legionaries became professional soldiers, serving for 16 years in the army. In contrast, non-Roman support troops were usually only hired for specific campaigns, and their units were disbanded when no longer needed. This changed after Rome fought a series of civil wars. Octavian, later known as Rome's first emperor, Caesar Augustus, won the last of these wars. Once fully in control of the empire, Augustus reorganized the army. The most significant change he made was the formal incorporation of the empire's non-citizen troops into units of professional soldiers in the Roman army. Upon inception, the Auxilia roughly comprised half of the Roman army, with there being around 150,000 legionaries and 150,000 auxiliaries. Because Augustus's reforms proved to be a resounding success, the number of auxiliaries in the Roman standing army increased to approximately 200,000 in the later 1st century AD. They further increased their number to around 250,000 by the end of the 2nd century. During this time, the Auxilia fluctuated between 50 and 60% of the total Roman army. In 212 AD, the Emperor Caracalla decreed that all free inhabitants of the empire were to be granted full Roman citizenship. This abolished their second-class status, and also created a much wider base of recruitment for the legions. At this point, there wasn't too much difference between the legions and the Auxilia, and as the 3rd century continued, these few differences disappeared as the empire spiraled into chaos and crisis. As the 3rd century AD drew to a close, the Roman army was undisciplined, disorganized, and demoralized, and barbarians from beyond the empire's borders were used to fill the ranks of all units in the Roman army. Then, the Emperor Diocletian restored order to the empire. Diocletian and his successors drastically reformed the Roman army, to the point where it bore little resemblance to what had come before. In this new army, units called the Auxilia Palatina were formed. After the Emperor Constantine disbanded the Praetorian Guard, probably because they had a nasty habit of assassinating emperors, many of the disbanded Praetorian Guard were used to form the Palatini, in contrast to the earlier auxiliaries, who formed the less prestigious bulk of the Roman army. The Auxilia Palatina were elite units, which fought in the armies personally commanded by the emperor. It is unclear whether the Auxilia Palatina were formed from the best of the old auxiliary cohorts during the Roman army's reorganization, or whether the name was merely used in homage to keep the memory alive of the ancient units of non-Romans who fought to protect the empire for centuries, so that the Auxilia's name and deeds would not be forgotten. In 395 AD, the Roman Empire permanently split in two. The western half of the Roman Empire suffered a slow, agonizing, and painful death, But the East persevered, all the way until 1453 AD, when it suffered a slow, agonizing, and painful death. But back to the glory days. Part 2. Organization. How'd they get it to work? The 5 fingers of the Roman army were: Number 1, the legions. Number 2, the Auxilia. Number 3, the Praetorian Guard. Number 4, the Roman navy. Number 5, the numeri. The numeri were barbarian allies, not incorporated into the Roman army structure. They fought using their own traditional arms, armor, and tactics. They did not have standardized unit sizes or length of service. Numeri were contractors. Their number, quality, and time employed varied wildly. They were most often used to guard remote border regions or to bolster a campaign army's numbers, hence their name, which literally means numbers. During Rome's heyday, the Roman navy had 2 permanent fleets of 50 warships, which were based out of Italy. Their primary task was to protect commercial shipping, especially the massive grain shipments from North Africa, which kept Rome's population fed. These 2 fleets, along with smaller provincial fleets, were usually more than enough to deal with any threats of piracy or rebellion. However, when needed, Rome proved on multiple occasions that it was capable of building hundreds of additional ships in a short amount of time. The Praetorian Guard was the emperor's personal bodyguard and the only soldiers allowed to carry their weapons throughout the city of Rome. Compared to legionaries or auxiliaries, they served for fewer years and were paid much better. Despite this, they frequently failed at their intended purpose, sometimes on purpose, of keeping the emperor alive. If Rome's legions were the backbone and skeleton of the army, then the Auxilia was its flesh, tendons, and muscle. The 25 to 33 Imperial Roman legions had around 5,500 men in each of them. In contrast, auxiliary units were not organized into army-sized units like the legions. The core auxiliary unit was the cohort, which had 500 men in it. The ally was the auxiliary cavalry version of a cohort. So why were auxiliaries not organized into larger auxiliary legions? 2 reasons why were: 1, tactical flexibility, and 2, was to reduce the risk of rebellion. When Roman legions were deployed on campaign, auxiliary units from the surrounding region would be attached to the legion. Small cohesive auxiliary cohorts could be easily detached to guard supply lines, forage for food, scout ahead, and garrison friendly or newly captured towns or cities. This protected the elite legions from getting picked off and suffering unnecessary casualties if they got overextended. On the defense, auxiliary cohorts could be spread over a very large geographical area, which meant they could quickly respond to threats. Also, when supporting a legion, the auxilia's superior knowledge of the region's terrain and locals must have been valuable as well. Because cohorts were not organized into larger legions, it made it more difficult for these units to conspire together to rebel. But even though it was more difficult, it was not impossible. After a couple of auxiliary rebellions in the 1st century AD, the Romans adjusted their policy. Instead of stationing auxiliary cohorts in the same region as they were recruited, it became standard practice to deploy auxiliaries in another area of the empire, far from their native land. However, local recruits were still used to replenish the ranks of the cohorts, with the exception of cohorts of archers, whose replacements were almost always recruited from the original eastern provinces where the cohort was raised. This new system worked extremely well, and auxiliary rebellions became almost non-existent. Another side benefit of this system was that it sped up the Romanization of the empire. An auxiliary archer from Damascus, stationed in the west, would have felt he had much more in common with the familiar Roman culture than with the local people where he was at, and vice versa. An auxiliary of Gallic origin, stationed in the east, would have felt he had more in common with Roman culture than with the local culture where he was at. Additionally, most auxiliaries started families with local women. If they managed to stay alive for 25 years in the Roman army and were honorably discharged, they were given 2 bronze sheets called a diplomata, which certified that the holder was granted Roman citizenship. This citizenship extended to all the children the auxiliary had while he was in the army, but not to his female partner. Any future children they did have would be citizens, though. Any of his citizen sons could qualify to join the legions. However, a surprising number chose to join the same auxiliary cohort that their fathers had served in. even though the pay and prestige was less than being a legionary. Being in a familiar environment, surrounded by familiar faces in the extended family of the auxiliary cohort, was preferable for many. Consequently, throughout the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, the amount of Roman citizens in the Auxilia steadily increased. So who was paid more? You guessed it, unless you were an auxiliary cavalryman. Then the pay was a little bit better. Imperial Roman legionaries were paid 225 silver denarii per year, which was equivalent of 9 gold Arius coins per year. This was later raised to 300 denarii, or 12 gold Arius coins per year. There is very little evidence for the base salary of the auxiliary infantrymen, the majority of which were called caligati, or sandalmen. The old scholarly consensus was that auxiliary caligati were paid 1/3 of a legionary's wage, so around 75 to 100 denarii per year. More recent estimates put the base auxiliary pay much higher, at 188 to 250 denarii per year, or 10 gold Arius coins per year. Although this pay gap is much closer, auxiliaries do not appear to have received the substantial bonuses and retirement package that legionaries received. In addition to infantry and cavalry units, there were also some mixed infantry and cavalry cohorts. These could effectively act as their own mini-armies that could respond to small-scale incursions or rebellions. This type of mixed cohort appears to have steadily gained in popularity in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. The vast majority of infantry cohorts were light infantry units. Around 1 in 12 was an archer unit. A cohort was commanded by a prefect. He was a Roman citizen, usually of Italian origin. A cohort was comprised of 6 smaller units, called sentries. Each sentry had 80 men and was commanded by a centurion. Auxiliary centurions were about evenly split between non-citizen infantrymen who got promoted up the ranks, and Roman citizens who may have been promoted from the legions. Part 3. Arms, Armor, and Tactics. Why did they do it that way? Compared to the typical Roman legionary, the auxiliary pedis caligati had a lot of the same or similar equipment, with a few key differences. First, the similarities. Both wore the caliga, a hobnailed sandal boot, as standard issue. This footwear was so associated with Roman soldiers that both legionaries and auxiliaries were referred to as caligati after the shoe. When it came to armor, both wore various types. Generally speaking, auxiliaries wore cheaper simplified versions of mail or scale armor. Most auxiliaries were considered to be light infantrymen, and the lighter version of the auxiliary chainmail would have aided in their mobility. Whether or not auxiliaries ever wore the iconic lorica segmentata to any notable extent is a matter of scholarly disagreement. The most common auxiliary helmet was a simplified version of the legionary helmet, typically made of brass, which was cost-effective yet efficient. The legionary carried a heavy javelin called a pilum. This was meant to be thrown immediately before engaging enemy troops in close combat, with his primary weapon, the gladius, a short thrusting sword. While the legionary was primarily a swordsman, the auxiliary infantryman, who also carried a gladius, was primarily a spearman, and the sword was used as a backup weapon. The standard flat oval shield carried by auxiliaries was dramatically different from the legionary's curved rectangular scudum. The scudum was a much heavier shield, specifically designed to benefit heavy infantry, fighting in close order, using a short thrusting sword as their primary weapon. In contrast, the lighter round auxiliary shield and spear combination was much more versatile. It was effective at both fighting in close ranks, or in a loose skirmish formation, armed with spear or javelins. On the battlefield, auxiliary infantry were typically deployed on the flanks of the legionaries, with auxiliary archers to the rear. Additionally, auxiliary skirmishers and/or cavalry were also deployed along the flanks. Although the Roman legionaries have always received the lion's share of the well-earned praise for the Roman army's success, most of the success would not have been possible without the humble auxiliary infantrymen holding the flanks. A testament to the resounding success of the Auxilia is that by the later 3rd and 4th centuries, when the Roman legions were reorganized, the weapons, tactical flexibility, and smaller unit sizes greatly resembled the old Auxilia. The Imperial Roman legionary was undoubtedly the more effective warrior. However, the auxiliary were more efficient and versatile. The Roman Auxilia was not only a military success, But it was also a success of social engineering, where hundreds of thousands were transformed from conquered people to stakeholders and beneficiaries of the empire. This has been Epimetheus. A big thanks to my patrons who help make videos like this possible.